There we go.
Along with the 8-hour day movement that was taking place at the time, the Chicago fire had a particularly large impact on a number of people, activists and citizens, because after the fire of 1871 that devastated the city, there was a campaign to raise money, charitable contributions to provide relief to the Relief and Aid Society. And in fact, what occurred was that some of the large industrialists, the McCormicks, the Fields, the Palmers, the Swifts, the Armours, utilized some of that money as an interest-free loan. And that outraged people. In fact, there were bread riots after that, riots in Chicago where there's some documentation of events where people would demonstrate, and one of the riots, people were forced under the LaSalle Street Tunnel. Back then, there were tunnels under the Chicago River that were used as opposed to bridges, and people were killed as a result of rioting and demonstrating. And this radicalized a number of individuals, people like Albert Parsons, who came from the South, who was one of the martyrs. He was a writer, he and Lucy Parsons, and they wrote about these issues. And this, they could not believe that the infrastructure, the government supported this kind of institutional greed, and people like August Spies, who came to America as a writer, a German immigrant who published the Arbiter Zeitung, a German newspaper and English newspaper, English-speaking as well as German for immigrant workers. And there were other men in the city who were outraged by these actions, and especially this boom and bust cycle that was taking place during the increasing industrialization period and large immigration period of the 1870s and into the 1880s. The ability for a few industrialists to make, 12 hours of profit from 13 hours of work or 14 hours of work. And so the idea eventually became 8 hours of work for 10 hours of pay. And that was just such a radical idea. But even before that, you had events that swept across the country, like a firestorm, the 1877 general strike, which was began as a railroad strike and turned into nearly a general strike across the country. And the importance of that event, I think, is not so much that it was the closest thing to a workers' revolution in this country, but how it radicalized the industrialists to realize that there was a growing movement of collective action against them. And so hence you begin to see the development of private security firms like Pinkerton's, and using the National Guard to protect the wealthy, creating a National Guard to protect the wealthy, the forts and armories, Fort Sheridan in Chicago to the armories. And this really is a process that's now taking place since the Civil War and leads us into the 1880s. In 1884, I think I had mentioned a little while ago that there was a call by the new organization of workers. The Knights of Labor had been organizing on a different kind of basis, and a new organization, a federation of trades and labor unions, organized and called for a general strike of 1886 to win the 8-hour day. You can only imagine the fear that was now in the hearts of the very wealthy, and some of the men who were organizing called themselves socialists, anarchists. They brought with them some of their German tradition as skilled workers, as engineers and as builders and as craftsmen, and the developing socialist ideas in Europe, especially in Germany, were being exported through these men coming to America and seeing what was a much greater injustice than they had imagined in terms of the working classes. So you had desperate poor people working 12, 14 hours a day, children and women working in factories, and working people unable to make a living. You had the development of the large ghettos of working people like back of the yards with the development of the union stockyards, the union of, which was a union of corporations. That was why they called it the union stockyards, where 80% of the meatpacking in America took place. So Chicago, being a hub, being a railroad center, being a manufacturing center, was a place of also working class activity and education, and men like August Spies, Adolph Fisher, Albert Parsons, Lucy Parsons, and many others became kind of notorious because they were considered radicals, although they were really preaching the idea of redistribution of wealth as a good thing for workers. This would have been cutting into the profits, and the rising wealth, stratification of wealth, built what we now call the Gilded Age, the great mansions along 18th and Prairie or on Ashland Avenue, and eventually other places in the city. But this was seen as kind of exuberant, extravagant wealth, really felt injurious to lots of workers, and it was not hard to get people behind the idea of a general strike for an 8-hour day, which led us to the Haymarket events.
Okay.